Okay, welcome to Gen X Medic. One of the things I enjoy is the interviews. I've got Andrew Bowman, paramedic, RN, nurse practitioner, and a really great advocate for good medicine. So, Andrew, would you please introduce yourself?
Well, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, whatever time you happen to be listening to this. As Roger mentioned, my name's Andrew. I started out 41 years ago as an EMT, and within a couple of years, I became a paramedic. Worked 911 service for several years up in Northwest Central Indiana for an organization called Tippecanoe Emergency Ambulance Service out of Tippecanoe County, Lafayette area. While doing that, I realized that being a medic lifelong probably not be good for my physical health. Uh, and as I jokingly like to say, I like the climate control, being indoors and not out in the heat, not out in the cold. So I went to Purdue and got my bachelor's in nursing, graduating back in 91. Did some minor studies during that time in biomedical engineering because the husband of the head of the school of nursing at the time was head of the biomedical engineering department. And they had some great programs that mixed life science major people with engineering people. So I got to learn how the monitors we use monitor the physiologic events. So that was a good, background for my career in healthcare. Worked as a nurse and still as a medic for several years, and then decided I wanted to do a little bit more, and then went on to get my master's in nursing at University of Southern Indiana, and I'm an acute care nurse practitioner, and I work for an emergency medicine group in Central Indiana, and we cover several community ERs. And so, in addition to that, I am one of the state EMS commissioners representing emergency nursing on the commission, and I am involved with the state trauma task force trauma committee as well. That's what I do.
Well, first and foremost, since you've been involved in EMS so long, the states that I know that have the best EMS as far as development and adaptability are Indiana, the state I currently work in, Missouri, and Texas. And they all have this thing where all EMS, as far as scope of practice, is locally controlled. Having been involved as long as you have, can you tell me how that developed in Indiana? I've heard some of the stories from one of our mutual friends, but I'd like to hear from your point of view.
Well, my knowledge of it is that as long as I've been involved in EMS, it's always been, local direction in Indiana. Each ambulance service has a medical director that oversees their operations and their protocols or guidelines or standing orders or whatever terminology you want to use. I know some people have, their favorite terms for that. But regardless, it's up to the medical director. And as you and I both know, that there are medical directors out there that are intimately involved, that are, on a day-to-day basis, reviewing what they want their staff to do, responding on calls, even as part of a 911 response in their chase truck. I've seen some really nice tricked out chase vehicles that some of these medical directors have throughout the state. But we also know that there's some that are just, putting their signature on and really not that greatly involved, and the whole spectrum in between. But it is important that the medical director be involved as intimately as possible. I'm not saying every medical director has to respond as a 911 responder, but they need to be involved to know what their EMTs and advanced EMTs and their medics are doing, and to making sure that they are keeping up with current evidence-based practice as to what works in EMS, what is good for the patient, and what is just showing off kind of stuff.
I mean, I came from Illinois, where we were regionally controlled. There was a good blog post back in 2009, I think it was, by a guy named Chris Kaiser, and he was talking about the little fiefdoms, how every region had these resource hospitals that were controlled by medical directors, and they never changed. So when I first got over here, I was in medic heaven. And because of that, I've stayed. Now, so what prompted me to ask you to be on this was a post I saw you made on Facebook.
I post a lot on Facebook.
Well, what really inspired me was you wanted to talk about how EMS needs to change and evolve and the ideas you had. I want to platform people like that. Where do you think we need to go, man? I want to hear you've got experience, you've got knowledge, you've got a breadth of education and knowledge that not everybody has. I want to hear what you have to say.
I think most of all, what I would like to see happen locally, statewide, nationwide, what have you, is that there be a well thought out approach to the education of the pre-hospital care provider, whether that be at the EMT level, the advanced EMT level, the paramedic level, that there's a good foundation of science behind it. Which, I remember when I took my paramedic class, I had graduated from high school, I'd gone to college for a year, didn't like what I was doing, was trying to make some choices, became an EMT and then paramedic class. And, I remember, this was 1983 when I was taking my paramedic training. It was bare minimum anatomy physiology. I didn't realize until later when I went back to school to get my nursing degree how much I didn't know about just basic human anatomy and physiology. Even though I had some good courses in high school, of course, in biology and stuff. But I think we need to have a stronger foundation of the sciences that support medical care, and that, biology, anatomy, physiology, chemistry, what have you, just so we have a scientific mind approach to the care that we are going to be giving our patients. I'm not saying that you have to have a college degree, but certainly having, a college program would facilitate that a lot easier than just having, some guy off the street who is going to try and teach that to you or not. So I think, we need a strong foundation for the basic education that our pre-hospital care people are starting out with. And then the second thing I think needs to change is there needs to be really almost a mandate for medical director involvement. It is crucial that the medical directors stay up to date on current pre-hospital medicine and emergency medicine in general, and that they're communicating those updates and changes to their people through, protocol development, skill development, and just ongoing continuing education, and just credentialing, certifying credentialing their staff to the highest level of care that they can be.
There's nothing you've said that I can disagree with. Anyone who knows me, one of my biggest criticisms is how we went about this accreditation process, because I actually think the idea of having standards in EMS education is important. I just am of the opinion that the current accreditation program hasn't achieved what we wanted it to achieve. I see that, you can tell that because you can tell the difference in different programs, quality of individuals that are coming out of them, and the fact that a lot of times we're not at the point that when they come out of class, they have a lack of confidence in what they're doing. But yet they have a lot of confidence that they can tell other people what they're doing, if that makes sense. We need to find a way we need better instructors, and we need instructors that are experienced, but they care about the science. They care about why we do things. You can teach a monkey to innovate, but my thing is you've got to know when to do these things. These skills only matter when there's the right time to do them.
I mean, a most recent example is a buddy of mine who's a very great paramedic, very good on using evidence-based practice as, someone who I see wants to deliver 21st century care, uh, contacted me about a week or so ago. He was working and there was a paramedic student there and they were going over some EKGs. And this student, they were going through it. And my buddy said, was talking about lead AVR. And the student says, "Oh, our instructor in class says, don't even look at AVR. You can't do anything with it." And so it's just that whole ongoing dismissive attitude of, they learned that maybe 20, 30 years ago, like I did. I was taught the same thing when I first learned EKGs. But, many years later, I discovered, hey, lead AVR can have useful information if you know what you're looking for. But, it's still the whole attitude that this is something that they learned and they never unlearned it. And they're passing it on to the next generation of people. And so we're passing on poor information. And so that we need to have a way to make sure that people are staying up to date on everything. And right now, there's no way to ensure that.
Not only do I agree with that, I'd like to expound a little bit. Why are we still teaching people how to put people on backboards as a form of spinal immobilization? That is probably the most disproven thing in EMS ever, and it's still something people are graded on.
I don't have an answer for that. In fact, just 2 days ago at work, they brought me a patient of a car crash on a backboard. But the funny thing is, he apologized for it. So, well, and I didn't have time because they brought us like 6 patients, so I didn't have time to sit down and mull over the fact with him. But, my brief thought was, well, if you're apologizing for it, why'd you do it? But I didn't have time to discuss it with him at the time.
There's times if someone's been put on a board to move them, hey, that's fine. I get
Sure.
it.
Sure.
But while I understand getting them off that board is not always the most critical thing, if you can get them off the board, you should get them off the board. And I use that as an example of, dogma. We were taught to do it. And I did it.
Yeah.
My grandpa did it. My dad did it. What have you?
Right. And these are the things that we're passing down because we're not stopping and saying, hey, the science says this, so let's stop this. And again, like you said, why are we being tested on it if it's not a critical intervention? Yeah, it helps me get the patient up from this ravine they were in after their car rolled down the hill. But once I get them up to the top of the hill, get them off the board, get them on the cart, and take them to the hospital. There's no reason for them to stay on it any longer than it takes to get them moved from point A to point B at the scene, but not point A to point B from the scene to the hospital.
On the few occasions I'll take a patient on a backboard, and usually if I'm taking someone on a backboard, I've got 15 other interventions that I've had to do that are much more important. You've got to, get an airway, things like that.
Right.
First thing you do when you get to the hospital is you get them off that board.
Yeah, as soon as I did my brief head to toe on this young person, I, got the team and got her off the board, and off we went.
So you're in an ER. How would you go about teaching new people who are coming into the profession patient interactions? Because you're as a primary nurse practitioner, you are the guy handling the interactions. How would you teach new providers how to talk to patients?
One of the things that I almost remind myself to do every single day, and the reason I do that is because I still fail at this. I still get annoyed with some of the things that happen. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, one of the nurses said, you seem kind of upset about things. And it was because, the person had come to the ER first thing in the morning woke up with back pain. And their first thought was to go to the ER. This was a young, otherwise healthy person, woke up with some back pain. They're walking and talking. from an objective standpoint, they don't look uncomfortable. Of course, I can't feel their pain, so I'm not trying to judge there. But this was a person who didn't even try like aspirin, Tylenol, Motrin. Their first reaction was get to the ER. And I kind of said, so you woke up this morning, your back was hurting, and your first thought was to do this and not take a Tylenol or something like that. And so, I probably approached that a little bit wrong. And so I try to tell myself, my almost daily mantra when I'm getting ready to go to work is be a good man, it'll be a good day. And so if you just try to not be judgmental, and we all are guilty of that, and me probably more than the average Joe, try to understand that the person is there seeking help for whatever concern that they may have. And it's our job to, number one, determine, what exactly are they seeking? And two, trying to, if we don't feel that we can meet what they need or what they're requesting, doing a good job explaining why we can't. Like, guy comes into the hospital with severe back pain and says, I need an MRI. Well, examine them first, do a good job of a calm examination and a thorough examination. And then if, clinically, if an MRI is warranted, then sure, we're going to get it. But then if you feel that your exam doesn't warrant an MRI, being able to explain that to the patient or whatever thing that they are, seeking that you don't think that they need from a clinical standpoint. So being able to sit down and calmly and rationally explain, here are your concerns, here are my findings, here's what we can do, here's why I don't think we need to do what you're wanting. So it just takes practice of being able to rationally and calmly explain to the patient what their concerns are. You're echoing those concerns back to them, but also letting them know what you're finding and how you are less concerned about those needs.
Yes, and one of the things, and maybe this is a skill set. We come up at a different age where communication was different. I almost want to take some of the younger students I have and take them to an old man bar, sit them down, and just have a conversation with someone who's in their 50s, 60s, and just learn to talk to them. Because my personal assessment style, my most important thing I say is hi, and I introduce myself. I do everything as a conversation because I feel that takes away, when you show up in a uniform and body armor and everything else that we'll wear onto the streets, people don't see you as a human being. They see you as that uniform.
They see you as a cop sometimes too.
Right. And everybody in medicine loves medicine TV shows. Because, hey, we'll watch this medical show and we can point out, oh, that's crazy. That never happened. But sometimes there's very profound things on that. And Dr. House always talked about how patients lie. They lie because they don't trust you, because they don't see you as a person. They see you as a uniform. So I always try to find something to talk about that this person's interested in. And then it breaks down that barrier, I guess. And I realize a lot of younger people never developed some of the conversational skills that we had to develop growing up because, you throw a text at somebody or what have you, and you don't read body language, you don't read what's going on.
Right.
But how do you improve? How do you put that into an educational program?
Well, two things I remember distinctly about that kind of interaction is, number one, in high school, health class. We spent a good amount of time just on like business introduction, how you would introduce yourself to a new person you're trying to do business with or meet. So, how to make good eye contact, how to shake their hand, firm but not too firm, not a loose grip, not a wet grip, and then, being able to, say your name distinctly and what you're there for. But then also one of my very early emergency medicine physician that I worked with when I first started out in the career surveil 41 years ago, Dr. Richard Shoemaker. He was not emergency medicine trained. He was one of those grandfather guys. They were family practice kind of, running the ER, and he was very good at it. But every single time he would walk in the room, he would shake their hand and introduce himself. And I tried to do that every encounter today, even if it's a little kid. If it's a kid, it's an adolescent, someone my age, it's an octogenarian. I try to do the same thing. I walk in the room, I introduce myself. If they're able to shake my hand, I shake their hand. Sometimes even like I'll even mention, it's like if I see that they're here for like a right shoulder injury, I'll purposely say, we're going to shake lefties because I know your right arm hurts, to kind of break the ice a little bit. But just doing a semi-formal introduction of who I am, what my role is. I'm Andrew, I'm the nurse practitioner, I'm going to be taking care of you here today. And the other thing that I think is important, and there's terminology for this that I won't get into, is that there's someone in the room with them, I make sure I know who that person is. I'll introduce myself to the patient first, then I'll kind of gesture. I said, and who is this with you today? And having learned over the years not to assume that it's a wife or a girlfriend or a boyfriend or what have you, just leave it as an open-ended, who is this? And if the patient tells you, great, or if the person introduces themselves, even better. But it kind of just sets everyone at ease that, they know who I am. I'm interested in who they are and what the relationships are. And then we get into what's going on and why are you here? And of course, sometimes that introduction is very brief. If someone's, starting to crash on you, they're having trouble breathing, they're in respiratory distress or in flash pulmonary edema, something like that. That's obviously a very brief introduction, but still an introduction's made, and informing them that I'm there to help them.
Yeah, and to me, that introduction, it lowers people's anxiety. It lowers that stress level because it makes them feel like, well, I matter. Stupid street trick I found: if someone's got a pet, acknowledge their pet. If they're not that critical, because then all of a sudden that pet's important to their life. You're taking those things that matter to that person, and you engage on their level.
And sometimes I'll ask, especially with an elderly patient, I ask, who do you live with? And quite often it's just like, their dog or their cat. And I always say, well, I'm a cat person. What kind of cat do you have? And again, it's just kind of to set them at ease a little bit that I've got an interest in them and makes them more comfortable.
Okay, well, I always get to the point I want to find out more about the person. Something I've been meaning to ask you that has absolutely nothing to do with medicine. You have a very interesting hobby to me. Fountain pens. Of all the things, why fountain pens? I want to hear this.
I get asked that a lot, and the answer is kind of nebulous. Years and years and years ago, I remember digging around my father's desk at home, and I remember finding these little, what I now know were fountain pen ink cartridges, which I find interesting because I never saw my father use a fountain pen. And in fact, it wasn't until a few months ago, my dad died last year, lived to be 90, had 90 great years. It was a few months later, my mom found in a box somewhere going through stuff, an old fountain pen that he had. Again, I had never seen him use it ever that I can recall. But I remember, as a kid of 5, 6, 7 years old, going through the desk and finding the cartridges and just saying, oh, those are cool. So that's my distant memory of what I knew about fountain pens. So flash forward to about 3 years ago, went through a lot of personal changes in my life. I had been in a long-term relationship with a young woman, and that broke off just as pandemic was hitting. So all I had in my life 3 years ago was I go to work, I go home, go to work, go home, because there was nothing else to do. Everything was shut down. You couldn't go to theaters. You couldn't go. There was no concerts. Conferences were being canceled. Restaurants were closing. You couldn't go anywhere. And I was alone. My children are grown. They were both in college at the time. They're both graduated now, but they were both in college. So they, busy themselves, didn't have time to do a lot of stuff with dad. And we lived about a half hour away from each other. So it was all just a cycle of work and home, work and home, work and home. And I was going out of my mind. I needed something to occupy myself. And one day I went out to the mailbox and there was this catalog from a stationery company, and thumbing through it, I saw that's a neat looking pen. I think I'm gonna buy that just to see what it's like. And I just went crazy after that. Got my first fountain pen, so that was late summer of 2020, and first fountain pen I'd ever owned or in my memory ever recall ever having used, and just kept buying more and more. And it's the fascination, I guess, for lack of a better word, is there's almost a calming effect of using a fountain pen. So first off, all the fountain pens I have are screw on. It's caps. So there's a methodology to unscrewing the cap. There's very little effort to using a fountain pen. It's like, if you use a ballpoint pen, you got to press down pretty hard, or a roller ball pen. Fountain pens release their ink by capillary action. So as soon as pen tip comes in contact with paper, the ink starts to flow. So it requires no effort, no pressure, no force to write. And so you just kind of have this nice, and my handwriting is still atrocious. I'm still trying to improve on that. But there's, you don't feel like you have to be forceful to put ink to page, to put words on paper. And so there's just this kind of slowing down effect that using a fountain pen has on me, from the taking it out of your pocket, unscrewing the cap, putting the ink to the paper, and then when you're done, putting the cap back on, putting it back in the pocket. And it just kind of has a calming effect on what is otherwise sometimes a less than calm day. And plus, it generates a lot of questions from people. Like, I'll be at a conference or at a meeting, and I'll take out one of my nicer pens, and it draws people's attention. Like, a lot of people haven't seen one forever or ever, and they get interested, not to the point that they want to use it, but just like, it's just something new and different that they've not seen before. So it's just kind of being a little bit different from the rest of the crowd. So like I said, I got about close to 50 pens now that I've got in my collection, and I keep about 6 or 8 of them inked up at any one time to use. So, but I take them to conferences, take them to meetings. I don't take them to work so much because at work, still having to fill out forms that require copies, and fountain pens don't do a good job of that. So I still use a good trusted ballpoint for work, which is fine. But everything else, I try to use it all the time. So it just gives me a little bit of pleasure in sometimes a less than pleasurable world.
You know what? That's a great story. Already, just from this conversation, I now have a stupid goal. We have a local physician. And you ever meet one of those people who are they make you feel dumb by their very existence with no effort on their part?
Oh, yeah.
This guy's a chemical engineer who's like, while I'm doing this, I'm just going to become a doctor in the process. And he can take very complex ideas and make them extremely understandable, which is what I consider the true hallmark of an intelligent person. I'm enjoying this conversation. I'm not saying a lot because, man, I'm enjoying listening to you talk. you have good ideas, you have goals. You know,
It's kind of like, you've heard the now late physicist Richard Feynman.
yeah,
So it's kind of like that, super brilliant guy, but he could take a concept and just make it exceedingly simple. And probably the best example of that is during the space shuttle um, Challenger investigation. He was on this board put together by the government to investigate, why did the Challenger blow up and what can we do to prevent it? And NASA, and there's a good documentary on Netflix about this, NASA was just kind of dismissing the idea that it was the O-rings were the problem until during a live televised segment of this, investigation, Richard Feynman, using a glass of ice water, a C-clamp from a hardware store he'd gotten the night before, and a piece of rubber, showed that when that O-ring material gets cold and you compress it, it doesn't re-expand. And it just took like 30 seconds to show how NASA screwed up in the most simplistic way. And so he's that kind of guy too, where he could just take a complex idea and say, well, here's a simple way to explain it that everyone can understand.
oh, me, I grew up, and one of the more fascinating doctors I ever saw was Dr. Red Duke. God rest his soul.
Yep,
And he
good
was
guy.
that way. And I've read more about him as I've gotten older. And I didn't realize just how brilliant he was till I met some people from Texas who would tell you about him who'd met him. Like, this guy was the most country Texas doctor you ever met. He's also a brilliant trauma surgeon.
Right.
And
And he used to have some kind of show on TV like 30, 40 years ago too, the little half-hour show or something that they did for a short time.
yeah, I looked it up and can't remember the name of it, but he inspired it. It's just this, and I vaguely remember it. I mean, I was a kid, but
Yeah.
oh, isn't it amazing how EMS and emergency medicine just gets in your blood and you can't? I've seen so many people leave it and then they come back to it because I don't think there's anything as satisfying as a good day at the job where you actually make a real difference there. I've never found anything that made me feel as good work wise.
Yeah, I mean, it can, when things are going well and, you're doing a good job and people are responding appropriately and you're giving good care, then those days feel great. And then the very next day, you can make one little error or mistake, or someone doesn't respond the way you think they're going to. And it's the lowest of the lows sometimes. So it's a sometimes sine wave of emotions for it's almost like manic depression medicine. You've got great super high
Yes.
days and you got really bad super low days. So
And
it can be all over the map.
and then there's one of my biggest joys now is teaching and precepting. And to see someone get something, I've to see a student progress and all of a sudden they just take charge and make decisions and are just in that zone and you're like, yeah, it's worth it. Things like that are what really makes this work, in my opinion. And I would, I want to get better, and that's why I do this. And I'm trying to get, it's the third interview I've done, and every one of them has brought something different to the table. The level of science you're bringing is amazing, and I really appreciate it.
Well, it was a little over 10 years now, kind of expanding on that science aspect you just mentioned, is a group of doctors were sitting together in a pub in Ireland. They were attending an emergency medicine conference. And this group of doctors came up with a concept that we now know as FOAMED, or some people call it FOAMED, FOAMED, which stands for Free Open Access medical education. And as you and probably everybody's going to be listening to this will know, is that it's really exploded over the last 10 or 11 years. And that's something I just kind of fell in love with, because as not being affiliated with a university or a college setting in my work environment, it was hard to get access to journals. In fact, there was a point in time where I was a member of so many organizations just to get the official journal, which got, of course, prohibitively expensive. And then foam came along, and these were emergency medicine doctors initially. It's now spread to almost all areas of medicine, but emergency medicine led the curve on this, where they were taking, their research, their evidence, their cases, and putting them out onto social media, whether that was Facebook or Twitter, a little bit of Instagram, mainly Facebook and Twitter is where that still is run, but also creating their own blogs and podcasts, which exploded almost exponentially over the years, with the sole goal to teach people what they knew so far about this clinical condition, this aspect of medicine, this problem, this event, and how to treat it. And it was inspiring. So what I try to do is share that information that comes into me. So every day I review many websites and blogs and podcasts. And if I find it interesting to me, then I share it to the people who follow me on social media as well, through Facebook and Twitter, just so that people can stay up to date and see what's current. And, you do have to look at it with a practiced eye. I mean, it's just like reading a journal article. It may be a great journal article. It may be a bad journal article. This may be great foamed information, may not be. You have to treat it the same way. You have to not just accept it as, the gospel truth. You have to look at it and say, does this meet the rigors of good evidence? Did they use good practices to, research this? Do they have good controls? What have you? And again, I'm not an expert at that. I try to be better. But you still have to look at, everything that's being introduced to you as a new way to take care of something or someone, with the idea that, it may not be what it says it is on face value. So you have to read it and, try to understand it better. But what I like to do is share what I find with the people who have decided to follow my social media presence. And so I share stuff on a daily basis, and it can be anything, cardiology, pre-hospital care, emergency medicine, trauma care, what are the advances, in different areas of medicine that are going to impact someone who's delivering care in EMS, at someone's home, at the side of the road, at someone's place of business, or in the emergency department, just so that they can try to stay up to date on what's current, but also to interact with their medical directors and say, hey, there's something out there that we might be able to employ in our service, in our protocols, to our patients that we take care of. And so using that as a way to frequently interact with your medical director as a way to improve the care in your community. So working collaboratively with your medical director so that you're staying up to date, you're keeping them up to date, and also hopefully the medical director is doing the same thing in the reverse order. They're learning things and sharing with the people that they are responsible for. And so just, it's a collaboration. It's not all just one way.
I would love to put individuals like you into the NAEMT. I am one of my things that I wish we could do is have a better lobbying organization. The NAEMT doesn't lobby. They promote cards. They send a bunch of people to Capitol Hill to talk to them once a year in uniform, but they don't ever put a real presence there where we're advocating for what needs to be done. The nurses have done an amazing job at advocating for themselves. That's one of the things I really admire about the nursing profession. It's the fact that they realized they could do more, and they stood up and said, "No, we're going to do this." And it's one of the places I think EMS is. We didn't want to get involved in politics. We were above it, and sadly, we've got to get involved in politics to fix the problems. We talk about education. I've said many times you could build a 4-year program for being a paramedic and just scratch the surface of the things that people need to know. But to get there, you've got to make it so a way it makes sense for people to invest that kind of money and time into becoming a paramedic. And that comes down to reimbursement and how you get there. And the only way to fix those things requires getting politicians to see it as important, to make it essential, to make it a requirement, and to get people to actually understand that billing matters, that outcomes matter.
And I think we've demonstrated that this year already with what's happened in Indiana legislation with this last, budgetary session with the money that they devoted towards EMS this year. Do you listen to Dr. Yeasel's monthly in services?
No, I don't. I need to get a link to that. To be honest, I'll probably
Okay.
Mr. Turpin up if I don't hit you up for it.
Yeah, so he actually had one today, but typically he started this in the last few months. I've attended a couple of them, and he does it typically on the first Wednesday of every month. But one thing that he reminded us of today is that, this year, Indiana government, gave EMS millions of dollars over the next 2 years to try and improve training, equipment, retention, and to try and expand, EMS in Indiana, and put money behind it. So fortunately, for the first time in probably a long time, a funded mandate as opposed to an unfunded mandate. And the other thing that the legislation did this year is that they funded for a trauma care commission. For many years, Indiana has had a trauma care committee, which I'm proud to say I was there at the beginnings back in 2004, I believe it was, when they started having the first conversations about a statewide trauma system. But for years, there's just been what's called a trauma care committee, which I guess from a governmental standpoint, a committee is something that can be dismissed by just the flick of the wrist and a signature. Is put into existence by a governor years ago, signing a piece of paper. If the governor, before legislation got passed this year, if he decided he wants to disband the committee, boom, piece of paper, signed, done. Now we have a trauma care commission, which is set up by state legislation. And so it had to be, the only way to get rid of it is to have legislation to get rid of it. So it's not just a flick of a wrist anymore. So we now have in Indiana a trauma care commission that's going to be, formed by different people. It's going to be, limited by who are actually on the commission. There'll be lots of subcommittees that feed into those commissioners, kind of like the EMS commission is. But we now have a way to improve our trauma system in Indiana by having a commission permanently set to guide it, and it has money to support it finally. And they did the same thing for EMS. They put a lot of money into EMS over the next 2 fiscal years to try and make EMS better. And then also, I just recently saw through Indiana EMS Association that there's probably going to be some improvement in getting reimbursement from Medicare, Medicaid for EMS. So that's another big improvement. I've not read that email in detail yet, so I don't know all the details, but it just kind of was headlined as, better reimbursement for EMS in Indiana. So that's all good news so far for Indiana for funding and for legislation and for reimbursement.
That's very important. We've got to move away from a fee for transport system. I know with ET3 we're trying to get there, but this whole we're going to we're just going to pay you to take someone to the hospital. Well, some things you don't need to take people to the hospital for.
Right.
I mean, you know, diabetics, well, usually once you fix the sugar, they're fine. You know, cardiac arrest. You shouldn't be moving people in cardiac arrest unless there's specific reasons, such as, refractory fib, things like that.
Right. And
But
your destination has a way to take care of that.
but
Yeah, and I think, again, the origins of EMS and still, most of EMS, as far as the government is concerned, is a transport service. It's not a treatment service. It's not medicine in the eyes of, the government. It's transporting someone from A to B, from place to place. And we need to make people understand, need to make government understand, make public understand that, yeah, part of the role is transporting, but 2, transporting to the appropriate facility, and 3, rendering proper treatment while transporting to the best appropriate facility. I'm a big proponent of the concept of ET3. I was really happy when Lee Turpin was getting that set up down in Evansville. I know it's not had the greatest success, is my understanding, but there's a learning curve to it, not only from EMS side, but also public side. And, in the end, the limitations are going to be, what do you have in your community to support it? Most of my towns that I work in aren't going to be able to support that because we don't have any other resources other than the hospital and the ER. But larger cities are going to have mental health resources, are going to have behavioral health resources, substance abuse resources that some communities don't have. And if you can utilize them, saying, okay, Billy here is just really intoxicated. He's not an otherwise healthy person. He's interested in getting help with his drinking problem. Probably doesn't need to go to the ER, but we have in our community a, alcohol treatment center. Take them there. And, having someone, being able to sign off from a medical side, and that could even be like an advanced practice provider as part of the triage process. Either doing a face-to-face evaluation or, a telehealth kind of evaluation, just to make sure that there's no pressing medical issues that need to be addressed concurrently. And if there's not, then you take them to the specialty center that can give them the help they need for what the problem is.
so one of the things I'd like to figure out how to do, and I don't know how to do it in shore-based EMS. I used to work, one of the jobs I worked as a remote paramedic on oil rigs.
Oh, cool.
Which was a completely different world. It changed the way I look at a lot of things because now you don't have a patient for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
You have a patient for hours or days at a time. You do wound care. Someone's got you do. I've removed ingrown toenails as a medic. Okay, that's just, it sounds silly, but that's that was an important job for that guy.
Sure.
But one of my funniest stories is, sometimes you get lucky, right? I'd read a story about pacemaker patients having a weird ventricular reentry phenomenon because of the scar tissue. At times, there's only a few doctors who could do the ablations for that. Now you can get it, hey, need it next week, set it up. Not a big deal. But this was, 10, 15 years ago. It was 15, 16 years ago. And my roommate woke me up because his chest felt funny. And I just read an article when I was back home about that. It just happened to catch it. I look like a genius, and I just got lucky to read an article while I was sitting around a station, But I learned. Go ahead.
That kind of reminds me, kind of that, that perfect timing is one of the things that got me interested is kind of preceding foam uh, paradigm is the use of handheld technology. When Palm devices first came out, don't remember those at all, like, you know, the Palm 5, the Palm 3, things
Yes.
like those, where you could have a little mini library literally in the palm of your hand, hence the name. And I remember distinctly, I was a nurse in the ER on a night shift. A patient checked in who had been coughing up blood. And the triage nurse said, they've got a condition called Wegener's something or other. And I'd never heard of it. But in the palm of my hand, I had this little device. I had my little library on there. And I knew, oh, Wegener's granulomatosis, which is a vascular disease. They can have bleeding issues. So I could walk into that room and act, at least give the patient some confidence that I at least knew what he had. Yeah, I didn't know all the details about it, but he was reassured by the fact that I knew even a little bit about his condition, which helped put him at ease a little bit. So just having that timely access to information can be, if not life-saving, at least life-calming for not only the patient, but also for yourself. Going in and say, okay, I can spend 60 seconds reading this thing on my palm in my hand and have a basic idea of something that I didn't know anything about 5 minutes ago to have a better understanding. So it's kind of the same thing. You had just read an article about it. You had that knowledge of forethought. Same thing here. Why I love having my device, my iPhone with me at work, in my pocket when I go into a room or if I go into a room, because I can look up stuff right away. Get all my drug calculations done for me, have a resource to, a library of information that makes my job so much easier.
I had to hang a dope drip a few months ago. My partner's like, "How'd you do that so quick?" I just held up the app I have just for calculating dopamine drips. Because how often do you do that? Although recently I've been doing it a lot, but that's just somehow things will happen where you do it a lot in a short period of time, which I've never understood how that random occurrence happens.
Yeah.
But what I learned working off there was I've become a big proponent of actually coming up with a way to have a paramedic mid-level provider, because one of the failures of ET3, I think, is the technology aspect, because it's toward older people, and getting a lot of older people to trust locally, trust someone on a phone, isn't as
Right.
good as just having someone who can sit there and talk to them. It's that personal interaction. So if we had someone who could, you know, I can roll in a chase car with a iStat, cardiac monitor, and ultrasound, and I pretty much have the ER with me and can do a baseline assessment and figure out what's going on. And if a patient doesn't need to go to the hospital, we can handle that primary care job, which as an ER nurse prac, how important or how many people actually use the ER for primary care stuff.
Oh, sure.
In EMS, a lot of the stuff we deal with really is primary care stuff when we look deep into it.
Yeah. And in fact, just the other day, I was commenting to my physician partner saying, sometimes I don't mind an urgent care day in the ER. Sprains and strains and coughs and colds. Once in a while, it's not a bad gig. We're not being inundated with chest pain after chest pain after chest pain, etc. Memorial Day weekend, like, oh yeah, a lot of stuff going on outside. People are getting all these little minor injuries. Yeah, it's busy, but it's simple bread and butter stuff. And so there are some days when, yeah, the vast majority of what we're seeing in the ER is urgent care, primary care level problems, but they've got no place else to go for whatever reason.
This has been once when I worked offshore, one of your bread and butters is respiratory infections, because you've got these buildings, you have four people, 4 to 8 people sleeping in a room. One person gets the credit, runs through the whole place.
Right.
How much more sense would it be go out, oh, hey, they've got an upper respiratory, simple bacterial upper respiratory infection. Let's call them in some, amoxicillin or whatever is appropriate. Give them a shot of steroids to get all that stuff, you know, all the inflammation down, get them feeling better, get them on the antibiotics. You've saved them a trip to urgent care or to an ER. You've gotten them the care they need, and they feel good. You know, from every aspect, it helps. It helps the medical system. It lowers the overcrowding issue. Patients feel great because someone came and they did something. They come to me. You know, that's going to make them feel good. And we've
Right.
learned feelings matter. You know, the old thing, people don't sue what you do; they sue how you made them feel.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Yeah. I mean, if you did something that caused maybe even no harm to the patient, maybe made them uncomfortable or something, but you were right on top of it saying, hey, this happened, it shouldn't have happened, my bad, I take full ownership. More often than not, it's going to be, hey, it's okay. But if you ignore that problem or dismiss it, even though there might not have been any significant injury, they're gonna come after you because you made them feel bad and you didn't take ownership of it.
and I think a lot of us used to have. I know I had a call that changed my aspect or my outlook on EMS. You know, I killed a patient through following protocol rigidly, and I had a lack of knowledge. Now, I understand this is back in the day of a Life Pack 10. You know, we were lucky to have it. You know, we were glad we had that where I was working. There's no way I could have really understood that this was a preload dependent MI and that what I was going to do by following our standard protocol was going to have a negative outlook. And I always tell people not to do this, but we all do it. We look, outcomes more important to you than what you did. Because you couldn't change what you did really. But it's the fact it was a 38-year-old woman with kids who had a massive MI and it's preload dependent. And as soon as you take that preload away through following your protocol, she dumped.
Yeah.
And I sit there and watched her go from a MI sinus rhythm into VFib. And then she, was, a perfect confluence of events.
Right.
I started, of course, started doing stuff. We got her to the hospital. We got her back at the hospital. She was awake. What they didn't know is she had just a small little bleed in her brain. Something she would have never known about would have fixed itself. They give her thrombolytics. And if I had known more, I've always looked back. Instead of doing that, they would have sent her to a PCI center and she'd seen her kids grow up.
Yeah.
So I mean, those are the things that always get in the back of your head. And this is why these conversations are important. I'm learning things just from a different perspective, and I appreciate it. I know your time's valuable. You've worked hard to make your time valuable, and you deserve that. And so I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Well, it's my pleasure. I just, at the end of the day, I'm not one of those guys who thinks that, what I do is a calling. I got into EMS because my sister was a secretary in an ER and her friends were medics. And I thought what they did was neat. And, my dad was a volunteer firefighter. And so, he would, tell me stuff. So I just thought it was, something neat to do. I didn't feel particularly that it was, any kind of religious calling for me. And I still don't. It's a job, but even though I consider it a job, why not do the best you can at it? I'm not saying I'm a superhero. I'm not the end all be all. I lack a lot of interpersonal skills that I probably should have better knowledge of at my advanced age. But I still just want to do a good job when I go to work every day, and that's what I want everybody to do. I don't want people to feel that they have to act like being an EMT or a medic or a nurse or an advanced practice provider or doctor is some kind of higher mythical calling, but it's a job you do, and any job you do is a job worth doing as well as you can. And so why not do all you can to improve how you do it through your initial education, through your ongoing education, through your experiences, trying to learn from your experiences and trying to learn from those people who are around you. And that, excuse me, we should expect more than what we sometimes are seeing being delivered. Like the other day, the medic brings me the person from a car crash on the backboard, but then who apologizes for it? Well, just think about what you just said to me. If you were apologizing for it, what you did probably, did it cause any harm to the patient for the short term? No, but it's just not what we do anymore. Evidence shows that backboards don't help. Maybe even C-collars don't help all that much. So follow the science, stay on top of the science, and practice what we know works well for the patient. And sometimes that's just a calm voice and a warm handshake and a pat on the shoulder and some reassurance. More often than not, I've had people in the ER at the end of my encounter, they've been worked up, we didn't find anything bad, they're being discharged from the ER, and they'll often say to me, I was kind of concerned about this. And I say, it's always, I've done a good job if I can reassure you that things are okay. And they like that. They came in with this concern. They thought they were having something bad going on, a heart attack, appendicitis, pancreatitis, what have you. And I could reassure them that they were okay. And in fact, they were.
Well, and that's always a good feeling. And there's always the other side that I always look at people, and I'll tell patients, like, ma'am, I'd rather you call me and not need me than need me and not call me. But I've also found, just personal, the more someone apologizes for calling you or coming to you, the more likely they are to be really sick.
Yeah.
It's like
the classic farmer in the ER.
I had this, little old lady who called, and when we got the call, we were like, nah, no big deal. She called for chest pain in her 70s, and then, you get the follow up. Well, she just got done being treated for pneumonia and was on antibiotics. And, your mind goes to, oh, she's probably got pleurisy or something like that. And, you go in, well, you're going to do an EKG just because if you're having chest pain and you're in your 70s, I'm doing a 12 lead on you.
Right.
Unless I've got, unless you're like traumatically injured and there's 15 other things, I'm going to do it just because, yeah, it's probably just, from that pleurisy. And then thing comes out and it's like, oh, boy, ma'am, have you ever had any heart problems? But that lady did not think she should call the ambulance. I've had more than one where they're like, well, it's not that big a deal. I didn't need to call you. I'm sorry I bothered you. And you're like, no, ma'am, we need to get you to the hospital. We need to get you there now.
Yeah. I will never forget the very first time I gave a thrombolytic for an MI. I was still working as a medic, and we were hospital based. We worked out of the ER as well as the ambulance. And it was like 1:00 in the morning. And this was a college graduate student. So mid-20s guy who was up late a couple nights in a row studying for finals. And the night before, he said, like, for 15 minutes, he just felt like he had this bad sore throat. And it went away. Well, this was now the second night, the sore throat came back and it didn't go away. So he comes to the ER. So here's an otherwise healthy, mid-20s, 25, 26-year-old guy with a sore throat complaint. And so the ER doctor goes in, she assesses him, ear, nose, and throat exam, yada, yada, yada. Said, it's probably just a viral sore throat, no big deal. And just as she's going back to her desk to do his chart and get him discharged, she turns to me and she goes, this is stupid, but would you just do an EKG on him real quick? Sure. And so this is back in the day when, this was the old suction cup EKG leads. You had to put some goop on their chest, and there was no screen to look at. So you didn't see the EKG until actually printed out on the paper. So you didn't have any warning. So I'm just talking to the guy, and he looks great. I mean, he looks like any other healthy 26-year-old grad student at 1 o'clock in the morning who's jacked up a little bit on, caffeine from studying for finals and stuff. And as the EKG prints out, huge ST segment elevation, just enormous. And I looked at that, and it always printed out 2 copies. And as the first one came out, I ripped it off and I said, the doctor who's working tonight is kind of funny. She always wants to see the first EKG as soon as it's out. And I just took off at a run. That's when doctor, said her name. And this guy's having a huge MI at the age of 26 or so. And, we gave him, I think at the time, guys, probably streptokinase. I think this is probably even pre-TPA days. Probably gave him streptokinase. And he did fine, fortunately. But just, thank God for her gestalt on this guy to just, for whatever reason, made her think to get an EKG. Otherwise he would have been out the door in 5 minutes and probably dead half an hour later if we hadn't done that.
And they're like, what happened? He's 26. This doesn't happen.
Right. So it's just, those things that, as they say, make you go, I could have blown that off and missed it. And, it's a minefield, as they say, emergency medicine is the worst thing because, it's easy when people read the textbook. Sure, paraumbilical pain that became right lower quadrant pain over the last 24 hours with fever, chills, nausea, vomiting, and anorexia. That's appendicitis. I don't care who you talk to. But, I had a lady who came in with right lower quadrant pain, thought for sure it was going to be a gallbladder. She goes, but it's funny, every time I lay down, the pain gets worse. If I sit up, the pain gets better. It's because she had a ruptured ectopic, and every time she laid down, the blood would flow up against her diaphragm and irritate her diaphragm and cause pain. If she sat up, it settled down low in her pelvis, and the pain went away. It's like, crap. How do we could have missed this easily.
It would be so much easier if patients would just follow the rules.
Or if they were transparent.
Would you just do what you're supposed to?
Yeah. And I've said this more than once. It is sometimes better to be lucky than good. I have caught so many what could have been really bad outcomes just by, I don't know why I'm ordering this test, but I just don't feel right. Something's just not right about it. And ordering a troponin or a D-dimer or a pregnancy test, what have you. It's just, that's where the problem is.
One of the memes I see shared around is the person, showing the blood pressure of 60/40, and you print the button again because you don't like that one.
Yeah.
Never how it works for me.
Yeah.
I always get the blood pressure of like 240/180, and like, that can't be right. It's right. But that's, you always got to recheck. You've always got to do that. But sometimes you're just gonna luck into being right when you don't know, and it's always good for your patients when you luck into being right.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. If we had time, I have another dozen or more stories just like that, where just for the grace of God, I chose the right path that day.
Well, Mr. Bowman, it's been a pleasure. I'm going to let this go now.
All right, my friend.
Do it again. And if you shoot me a topic you want to cover, and I'll be glad to spend time to do it because I've enjoyed it. And I enjoy learning, and I hope other people get to learn from the things we're doing.
Happy to do so. And I will send along the link to Dr. Yazel's monthly thing for you, so you can participate. He's doing monthly in-service for us. So he's trying to get out there in the state and getting, some interest built to improve EMS care in Indiana. So trying to do the right thing from his standpoint. So
Thanks. that's always good, man. And I want better healthcare across the board, and I want better interaction and better. We need to get everybody on the same page.
Agreed.
Well, man, you have a good one. Have a good evening, and I truly have appreciated this. Thank
I
you, and
appreciate the time, Roger. Say hi to Lee for me.
I will be sure to do that.
You take care, my friend.
Take care, sir. Bye.
Bye.